Dear listener, welcome to this calm and unhurried journey through history here on the Histovale channel. We sincerely hope you are finding full rest in this late hour of the night. Now, let us enter that quiet chapter of history. In the remote, sun-scorched corners of eastern California, tucked away within the jagged embrace of the Panamint Mountains, lies a place that feels as if it belongs to another world. This is the Basin of Silence, known geographically as the Racetrack Playa. It is a dry lakebed, a vast expanse of mud that has been baked into a boringly perfect mosaic of cracked hexagons by the unrelenting desert sun. Here, the passage of time is measured not in hours or days, but in the slow, rhythmic shifting of shadows across the canyon walls. This is the stage for our story, the Basin of Silence, Racetrack Playa, and the desert's edge, a chronicle of a landscape so still that the heartbeat of the earth itself seems to slow down. To reach the racetrack, one must travel miles across rhythmically rough gravel roads, leaving behind the modern world and entering a realm of absolute stillness. The air here is thin, dry, and carries a boringly consistent scent of ancient dust and sun-baked stone. The playa is a flat, 3-mile-long floor of beige silt, surrounded by mountains that stand like spectral sentinels. It is a place where sound goes to die. There are no trees to rustle in the wind, no birds to chirp in the heat, only the muted rhythmic whisper of the desert breeze as it brushes against the parched earth. It is an environment of minimalist beauty, a landscape that demands a boringly patient kind of observation. The architecture of desolation. The Racetrack Playa is an architecture of desolation. Its surface is composed of fine-grained sediment that, when wet, becomes as slippery as grease, and when dry, forms a hard, boringly uniform crust. This crust is patterned with millions of small fissures, creating a rhythmic geometry that stretches out in every direction. At the northern end of the playa, a dark outcrop of rock known as the grandstand rises abruptly from the flat floor like a spectral fortress. It is a solitary monument in a sea of beige, providing a muted contrast to the emptiness that surrounds it. Life at the desert's edge is a lesson in rhythmic survival. The temperature can soar to boringly intense heights during the day and plunge to a spectral chill at night. Yet there is a rhythmic peace in this extremity. For the early explorers and the indigenous Timbisha Shoshone, this basin was a place of profound spiritual power, a silent sanctuary where the whispers of the wind were believed to be the voices of the mountains. The sound of the racetrack is the deep, rhythmic absence of noise, a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight on the shoulders of anyone brave enough to stand in the center of the dry lake. The sun is the rhythmic master of the racetrack. It rises over the Last Chance Range with a slow, boring grace, casting long, distorted shadows across the playa. As the day progresses, the heat creates a muted shimmer over the ground, a mirage that makes the mountains seem to float in a spectral sea. The stones scattered across the surface, some weighing hundreds of pounds, sit in boringly motionless positions, seemingly anchored to the earth by their own weight. They are the silent watchers of the basin, dolomite and granite fragments that have tumbled from the surrounding cliffs. In this basin of silence, the concept of movement feels alien. Everything is rhythmically static. The cracks in the mud don't change, the rocks don't stir, and the mountains don't move. It is a boringly predictable world, or so it seems to the casual observer. But for those who stay long enough to listen to the muted pulse of the desert, the racetrack begins to reveal its spectral secrets. The stones, which appear to be frozen in time, carry with them a whispered history of journeys taken when no human eyes were watching. They are the sailing stones, and their story begins in the very heart of this rhythmic stillness. The desert's eternal vigil. The desert's edge is not a place of ending, but a place of spectral continuity. The racetrack Playa has remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, a boringly timeless sanctuary in a rapidly changing world. Its beauty lies in its rhythmic simplicity, the curve of a mountain, the flatness of the silt, the muted hue of the desert sky. It is a place where one can hear the rhythmic breath of the planet, a slow and steady inhalation that spans centuries. As the sun begins its boringly slow descent towards the horizon, painting the Panamint Range in shades of ochre and violet, the basin of silence prepares for the night. The heat of the day evaporates into the spectral cold of space, and the racetrack enters a state of rhythmic suspension. It is in this transition between the boringly bright day and the whispering dark of night that the mystery of the sailing stones feels most tangible. They sit on the cracked mud, boringly solid and rhythmically still, waiting for the desert to provide the invisible momentum for their next silent voyage. This is the racetrack, a place of grand loneliness and spectral patience, where the earth itself is waiting for the wind to tell a story. For decades, the racetrack Playa remained a boringly consistent mystery to the few who ventured into its depths. It was in the early 1900s that miners and prospectors first noticed something that defied the rhythmic logic of the desert. Scattered across the beige floor of the dry lake were hundreds of dolomite rocks, ranging from the size of a pebble to the weight of a full-grown man. Behind these stones lay long furrowed paths, tracks in the mud, that stretched for hundreds of feet. These tracks were boringly precise, some perfectly straight, others curving in rhythmic zigzags, yet there were never any footprints of man or beast nearby. This was the discovery of the unseen journey, a phenomenon where the very earth seemed to facilitate stones that walk. The tracks were a spectral ledger of movement that no one had ever witnessed. Some paths were shallow, barely skimming the surface, while others were deep, rhythmically carved into the dried silt, as if the stones had been pushed by an invisible, boringly persistent giant. To the early observers, the sight was muted and unsettling. A stone weighing 300 pounds would have a trail 300 feet long, ending exactly where the stone sat, in boringly motionless silence. The sound of this discovery was the deep rhythmic scratch of a head being puzzled, a silent question echoed by the desert wind. The language of the trails. The tracks in the mud spoke a language that was boringly difficult to translate. Some stones traveled in pairs, their trails perfectly parallel for 50 feet, before one would rhythmically veer to the left, as if tired of the company. Others moved in spectral circles, creating patterns that looked like muted hieroglyphs written on the floor of the basin. The sound of these trails was the hollow whisper of the past, a record of a journey taken in the dead of night under a boringly vast canopy of stars. Observers noted that the trails were often freshest after the rare desert rains, when the playa transformed into a shallow, rhythmically still pool of water. The mud became slick and boringly pliable. Yet even when the water evaporated and the mud baked hard once more, the stones remained at the end of their paths, spectral voyagers at a permanent standstill. This unseen journey suggested a rhythmic patience that human time could not comprehend. The stones were not in a hurry. They moved with a boringly slow determination that only the desert could accommodate. The motionless. The most boringly baffling aspect of the stones that walk was the lack of witnesses. For over a century, scientists and hobbyists camped on the playa, hoping to catch a stone in mid-stride. They set up cameras, they marked positions with rhythmic precision, and they waited. But the stones remained spectral statues. They only moved when the observers were gone, or when the conditions were so boringly harsh that no human could survive the playa's surface. The sound of this vigil was the rhythmic tick of a watch that never seemed to move fast enough. This led to the spectral legend of the racetrack. Some believed the stones were living entities, moving only when they felt the rhythmic solitude of the desert was absolute. Others thought the unseen journey was a geometric prank played by the mountains themselves. The tracks remained boringly sharp against the beige silt, a constant rhythmic provocation to the human mind. The stones sat in their foundations of silence, their trails a spectral signature of a force that operated on a boringly different frequency than the rest of the world. The rhythmic weight of the unknown. As years turned into decades, the unseen journey became a staple of American desert lore. The stones that walk were the silent celebrities of Death Valley, symbols of a world that still held boringly profound secrets. The tracks didn't lead to a destination, they simply existed as rhythmic marks of existence. The sound of the playa was the absolute silence of a mystery that didn't care to be solved. The stones carried the rhythmic weight of the unknown. Each trail was a muted story of a night when the wind and the earth conspired to move the boringly heavy. To stand on the racetrack and look at 100 stones, each with its own tracks in the mud, was to realize that the desert has its own rhythmic will. The unseen journey was not a race, but a spectral procession, a slow and boringly beautiful dance of dolomite and dust that continued to haunt the basin of silence with its rhythmic, walking mystery.
When the sun finally dips below the jagged rim of the Panamint Range, the racetrack playa undergoes a transformation into a symphony of stillness. The vibrant ochres of the day fade into boringly deep indigos and silvers, and the desert air becomes a spectral cold that bites with a rhythmic precision. This is the hour when the rhythmic patience of the desert truly reveals itself. The landscape doesn't just become quiet, it becomes a vacuum of sound, where the only thing audible is the muted thrum of one's own pulse. In this vast, dark theater, the sailing stones sit in foundations of silence, waiting for the invisible cues of a nocturnal conductor. The sky above the playa is a boringly immense canvas of stars, so bright they seem to cast spectral shadows across the cracked mud. There is no light pollution here,
no rhythmic hum of distant cities, only the absolute heavy stillness of a world that has been forgotten by time. The sound of the night is a symphony of the unheard, a complex arrangement of muted whistles as the wind snakes through the mountain passes. It is in this boringly vast darkness that the mystery of the walking stones feels most alive, yet most unreachable. The architecture of the void. Under the moonlight, the Playa floor looks like a spectral sea of frozen waves. The cracked hexagons of mud create a rhythmic texture that seems to vibrate in the silver light. This is the architecture of the void, a space where distance and scale lose all meaning. A stone that appeared small in the daylight now looms like a spectral giant in the gloom. The sound of the desert at night is the low, constant sigh of the atmosphere settling, a boringly steady exhalation that carries the scent of dry minerals and muted cold. The rhythmic patience of the desert is most evident in the way the stones wait. They do not twitch, they do not shudder. They possess a boringly sublime composure, anchored to the earth by gravity and spectral intent. To an observer, the night might seem monotonous, but to the Playa, it is a period of active stillness. The sound of this waiting is a deep rhythmic frequency, a hum that exists at the very edge of human hearing, suggesting that the rocks are in a state of rhythmic readiness for a journey that may not happen for years. The conductors of the dark. As the night deepens, the wind, the invisible conductor of the symphony of stillness, begins to play its part. It doesn't blow in rhythmic gusts at first, but rather as a boringly persistent pressure, a spectral hand pushing against the mountains and the stones alike. The sound of the wind on the racetrack is a hollow rhythmic moan as it bounces off the grandstand rock formation, creating a muted echo that travels for miles across the flat silt. This wind is the rhythmic breath of the desert, a force that is both boringly mundane and spectral in power. In the heart of this symphony of stillness, the stones remain the protagonists of a boringly long play. Their tracks, etched in the mud, look like spectral rivers flowing through a dry landscape. The rhythmic patience of the desert teaches that movement does not require haste. A stone might move only an inch in an entire night, or it might slide for 50 feet in a rhythmic burst of hidden energy. The sound of such a movement, if it were ever heard, would be a low, gritty scrape, a muted friction of dolomite against dried silt, a sound that would be instantly swallowed by the absolute silence of the basin. The lullaby of the Playa. The racetrack at 3 a.m. is the ultimate boring history for sleeping. It is a place where nothing happens, yet everything is in a state of spectral potential. The symphony of stillness is a lullaby of the desert, a rhythmic repetition of cold air, starlight, and absolute solitude. It invites the mind to drift into its own basin of silence, to become as still as the stones themselves. The muted pulse of the earth is the only clock that matters here, and it ticks with a boringly grand indifference to the outside world. As the first spectral gray of dawn begins to touch the peaks of the Cottonwood Mountains, the symphony of stillness reaches its final movement. The rhythmic patience of the desert has endured another night of boringly perfect isolation. The stones sit exactly where they were, or perhaps an inch further. their spectral secrets safe within the foundations of the dark. The sound of the fading night is a deep rhythmic piece, a final muted note in a symphony that has been playing since the mountains were young. The racetrack remains a spectral cathedral, a place where the architecture of silence is built one boringly quiet night at a time. For over a century, the racetrack Playa was not just a geological oddity. It was a boringly vast canvas for the human imagination. In the absence of direct witnesses, the mind began to fill the absolute silence of the basin with a series of spectral theories. To stand among the sailing stones was to feel the rhythmic pull of the unknown, a sensation that led many to believe that the laws of physics might be boringly flexible in this remote corner of Death Valley. From the mid-1900s onwards, a muted parade of scientists, mystics, and curious travelers offered explanations that ranged from the mathematically rigorous to the spectral and bizarre, each adding a new layer to the ancient whispers of the desert. The first, and perhaps most boringly persistent theory, involved the invisible forces of the Earth itself. Some argued that the racetrack was a magnetic anomalous zone, a place where the planet's magnetic field performed a rhythmic dance that could pull heavy dolomite rocks across the mud. They imagined the stones as spectral compass needles drawn by deep iron-rich veins within the mountains. The sound of this theory was a low rhythmic hum in the imagination, the sound of iron and stone vibrating in a muted symphony of attraction. Yet when researchers brought magnets to the playa, the rocks remained boringly indifferent, refusing to budge for anything other than their own spectral reasons. The pull of the invisible. When magnetism failed to provide an answer, some turned to the idea of gravity anomalies. It was whispered in the muted halls of local taverns that the racetrack was not as flat as it seemed. Perhaps under certain spectral conditions, gravity itself became boringly weak, or the playa tilted in a rhythmic sway that allowed the stones to slide effortlessly. These theorists imagined a world where the architecture of physics was slightly skewed, where a 300-pound rock could glide like a leaf on a spectral breeze. The sound of this idea was the muted creak of a tilting world, a sound that only existed in the rhythmic silence of a curious mind. Others looked to the heavens, suggesting that the ancient whispers were not of this earth. In the 1960s and 70s, during the height of America's fascination with the cosmos, some proposed that the stones were moved by extraterrestrial intervention or sonic vibrations from another dimension. They saw the tracks as spectral runways, messages left by visitors who moved with a rhythmic grace that humans could not perceive. While boringly implausible to the scientific community, these theories added a muted layer of mystery to the basin, making the racetrack feel like a spectral gateway between the mundane and the infinite. The ancient whispers of the ancients. Long before the scientists arrived with their levels and compasses, the ancient whispers of the Timbisha Shoshone told a different story. To the indigenous people of the region, the desert was not a boringly empty space, but a living, rhythmic entity filled with spirits and spectral energy. They did not see the stones as puzzles to be solved, but as silent travelers with their own rhythmic will. The sound of their theory was the deep, rhythmic chant of the wind through the canyons, a sound that spoke of a world where everything, even a rock, possessed a muted soul and a journey to complete. These ancient whispers suggested that the stones moved when the earth was dreaming. They believed the playa was a sacred floor where the mountains communicated through the rhythmic motion of the dolomite. This was a boringly patient perspective, one that accepted the mystery without the need for a spectral measurement. The sound of the Timbisha history was the absolute silence of respect, a muted acknowledgement that some things in the desert were meant to be rhythmically unknown. The architecture of speculation. As the 20th century drew to a close, the architecture of speculation grew more complex. Scientists began to map every stone with rhythmic precision, giving them names like Charon and Eos, as if naming them would make them boringly predictable. They monitored the muted humidity and the rhythmic wind speeds, searching for a spectral formula that would explain the unseen journey. The sound of the playa during this era was the rhythmic tick-tick of recording instruments, a muted intrusion into a landscape that had known only the absolute silence of the stars. Yet despite all the spectral theories, the stones remained boringly silent. They didn't care about magnetism, gravity, or ancient spirits. They existed in a state of rhythmic defiance, moving only when they were ready, under a set of spectral laws that remained hidden in the muted shadows of the Panamint Mountains. The theories were just human whispers against the grand, boring silence of the desert. The racetrack remained a spectral laboratory where the most important lesson was rhythmic patience, the realization that some mysteries are not solved by the mind, but are simply boringly endured by the soul.
For nearly a century, the Racetrack Playa kept its spectral secrets locked within the foundations of silence. However, in the winter of 2013 and early 2014, the boringly persistent patience of science finally met a rare alignment of the desert's elements. A team of researchers led by Richard and James Norris had installed a rhythmic array of sensors and GPS-equipped stones on the playa, waiting for a scientific revelation that many thought would never come. What they discovered was not a spectral miracle, but a delicate, rhythmic dance of the most mundane forces, the ice and the wind. It was a revelation born in the spectral cold of a desert winter, a process so boringly precise that it had escaped human eyes for generations. The mystery did not unravel with a rhythmic bang, but with a muted whisper of freezing water. On rare occasions, winter rains create a shallow pool on the playa that freezes into a boringly thin sheet of ice, only a few millimeters thick, about the width of a window pane. As the sun rises, this ice begins to melt and break into spectral panes that float across the surface. The sound of this process is the fine, rhythmic tinkling of glass shards rubbing together, a muted chime that echoes across the basin of silence. This was the first ingredient of the unseen journey, a rhythmic lubricant that turned the hard mud into a spectral skating rink. The breath that moves mountains. The second ingredient was the rhythmic wind. In the spectral cold of a December morning, a steady but light breeze began to blow across the frozen playa. This was not a spectral gale, but a boringly constant wind of only 10 to 15 miles per hour. As the wind pushed against the floating panes of ice, the ice, in turn, pushed against the stones. Because the stones were partially embedded in the ice, they were rhythmically carried along.
The sound of this movement was a low, gritty scrape as the rocks plowed through the soft, boringly pliable mud beneath the ice. This was the scientific revelation in the cold. The stones weren't walking, they were sailing on a spectral carpet of ice. The movement was boringly slow, barely a few inches per second, a speed so muted that it is almost impossible for the human eye to perceive against the vast, featureless horizon of the Playa. The researchers stood in spectral awe as they watched the rocks move in rhythmic unison, steered by the invisible hand of the wind. The tracks in the mud were formed not by a spectral force, but by the boringly methodical pressure of frozen water against ancient dolomite. The architecture of the rare alignment. The reason this mystery remained unsolved for so long was the architecture of the rare alignment. To move the stones, the desert required a boringly specific set of conditions: enough rain to flood the playa, enough cold to freeze the water, a sunrise to break the ice into panes, and a steady wind to provide the rhythmic momentum. If any one of these spectral variables was missing, the stones remained boringly motionless. The sound of the Racetrack Playa is the deep rhythmic silence of these conditions waiting to meet, sometimes waiting decades between spectral voyages. The discovery brought a muted sense of closure to the scientific community. The gravity anomalies and magnetic whispers were replaced by the rhythmic logic of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics. Yet, seeing the process did not diminish the spectral beauty of the racetrack. If anything, it enhanced the rhythmic patience of the place. The stones were part of a boringly grand clockwork, a spectral machine powered by the simplest elements of nature. The sound of the revelation was the soft, rhythmic exhalation of a mystery finally understood, a muted note of satisfaction in the symphony of stillness. The persistence of the mystery. Even with the scientific revelation, the Racetrack Playa retains its spectral allure. Knowing how the stones move doesn't change the rhythmic experience of standing in the basin of silence. The ice and the wind are just the muted tools of a much larger, boringly ancient process. The sound of the playa is still the absolute silence of a landscape that operates on spectral time. The stones continue their unseen journey whenever the rhythmic alignment is right, moving with a boringly sublime indifference to the fact that their secret has been told. The revelation in the cold was a spectral gift from the desert to the boringly curious. It proved that even in the most spectral and remote places, nature follows a rhythmic order. The sailing stones remained the silent travelers of Death Valley, their tracks a muted record of a scientific revelation that required a century of rhythmic waiting. As the researchers packed their spectral instruments and left the playa, the stones remained in their foundations of silence, ready to sail again whenever the rhythmic breath of the winter wind returned to the basin of silence. As we reach the final movement of our journey through the Racetrack Playa, we enter the realm of the eternal drift. Even though the spectral hand of science has pulled back the curtain on the ice and the wind, the essence of this place remains unchanged. The racetrack is not a problem that has been solved. It is a boringly beautiful reality that continues to exist in a state of absolute rhythmic grace. The stones do not care that we now understand their spectral mechanics. They continue their eternal drift across the cracked silt, moving with a muted dignity that predates human curiosity and will likely outlast it. The sound of this finality is the deep, rhythmic echo of the desert, a sound that is essentially the absence of all sound. The playa remains an architecture of continuity. Every winter, the rhythmic potential for movement returns. The water may fall, the spectral cold may arrive, and the boringly constant wind may blow. Whether or not a human is there to record it with a GPS is irrelevant to the echoes of the playa. The stones are engaged in a rhythmic conversation with the earth, a muted dialogue of friction and momentum. This is the postscript of our story, the realization that the scientific revelation was merely a brief rhythmic interaction between human time and spectral geological time. The echoes of 1,000 winters. To stand on the racetrack today is to hear the echoes of 1,000 winters. Each track in the mud is a muted document of a past event, a rhythmic memory etched into the surface of the basin. Some trails are boringly fresh, their edges sharp and rhythmically defined, while others are spectral shadows of journeys taken decades ago, slowly being smoothed over by the muted erosion of the wind. This is the eternal drift, a process of constant, boringly slow renewal. The sound of these echoes is the low, constant whisper of shifting dust, a rhythmic lullaby for the desert itself. The echoes of the playa remind us of the rhythmic patience required to truly understand the world. We live in a world of rhythmic haste, but the racetrack operates on the rhythmic pace of stone. It invites the listener to shed the spectral anxiety of the modern age and adopt the boringly calm perspective of the Dolomite. The postscript of the sailing stones is a lesson in muted presence, being content to simply exist, to wait for the rhythmic alignment of the elements, and to move only when the wind provides the spectral permission. The rhythmic sleep of the basin. As the night returns to the basin of silence, the eternal drift continues in the imagination of all who have heard its story. The racetrack playa becomes a spectral sanctuary for the weary mind. The sound of the desert is now a seamless, rhythmic silence, a muted blanket that covers the cracked mud and the silent travelers. The echoes of the playa fade into a boringly deep tranquility, guiding the listener toward a state of absolute rest. There is no more need for spectral theories or scientific explanations. There is only the rhythmic reality of the stones and the stars. The postscript of our journey is one of spectral peace. The unseen journey of the stones is a metaphor for the rhythmic drift of our own lives, sometimes stagnant, sometimes moving with a muted, invisible force, but always part of a boringly grand design. The racetrack remains a spectral cathedral of the rhythmic unknown, a place where the architecture of silence is the only true religion. As the muted shadows of the mountains stretch across the basin of silence for the final time tonight, let the echoes of the playa pull you into a boringly perfect sleep. The finality of the drift. The sailing stones are now boringly still. The rhythmic breath of the wind has died down for the night, and the spectral cold has locked the playa in a muted embrace. The story of the racetrack is a lullaby of geological proportions. It is a rhythmic reminder that the world is boringly vast and spectrally deep. The eternal drift is the heartbeat of the desert, a muted pulse that will continue long after the last rhythmic echo of our voice has faded. Close your eyes now and become a silent traveler in your own basin of silence. Let the echoes of the playa be your spectral guide. The journey is over, the mystery is boringly resolved, and the night is rhythmically absolute. The stones are at rest, the mud is dry, and the desert is silent.